That is one of the things I'm most proud of in our district, that I think our staff have really embraced. We have tried very strategically, really over the last decade, to create a culture where students are open and trusting and will report. And that's what I think we've achieved. And I know that because when we receive alerts, when we receive alerts from our online monitoring of student interactions and what they're writing, what they're searching, those types of things, a lot of times it's actually emails from students to teachers saying, hey, I'm struggling with this, can you help me? Or I don't like how this child's interacting with me, what can I do about it? And so we know that we've established that culture because we see it in the reports that we get from students that allow us to intervene right away before we have a conflict in our schools or before something gets out of hand.
Hello, and welcome back for another episode of Leaders Saving Lives. This podcast is sponsored by Gaggle and meets with K-12 district leaders to talk about innovative strategies around providing safety and mental health solutions to their students. I'm your host, Ray Bledsoe, and today we're joined by the Assistant Superintendent of Community Consolidated School District 59 in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, Dr. Katie Ahsell. Dr. Ahsell is an accomplished educational leader with extensive experience in K-12 education, classroom management, and student support systems. Katie also has a strong background in designing and implementing multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS as it's known as, and behavioral intervention strategies, fostering innovative and inclusive learning environments. Katie, glad to have you here. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. We'll jump right in. And I think the first question I have, Dr. Ossel, is can you explain what MTSS is to those who might not be familiar and how it helps support student success in both academics and behavior?
Absolutely. A multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS, is really a framework with which we think about how we serve students in the educational setting. And so it takes the philosophy that the majority of students are going to be best served by our universal approaches, the things we do for all kids, the instruction that we provide to everyone in the school setting. And for some, they will need more or different. So when we identify that students need more, we provide what's called tier 2 intervention or supports to our students, in addition to that universal approach. And in cases where we identify that they need even more, we would layer on a third intervention or support, a tier 3 intervention or support, and potentially provide specialized services. So it's a way with which we look at data as educators to determine what level of intervention or support is going to best meet our students' needs, put that in place, and then study it.
Good. So it almost sounds like it's a custom or tailor-made approach to intervention on a per student by student basis. Is that
That's right.
accurate?
Yes.
Awesome. How do the early interventions within MTSS help identify students who may be in crisis?
Oh, that's a great question. And really, when we think about student safety, the key is early intervention and proactivity from my perspective. So a multi-tiered system of support helps us to screen students to determine who might be at risk or who might be needing more, hopefully before we have events that are harmful or unsafe in our school environment. So things like surveying students about their emotional well-being, surveying them about their social needs or how they're responding to others in the school setting gives us data where we can say, this group of students may be needing more right now. Let's put something in place right now to develop their emotional awareness or their self-management, or their ability to cope with big things happening in their lives. And when we provide that instruction before we have big incidents happen, we often give them the skills that they need to report things, to reach out for help, and to avoid having harmful things happen later on. So that's the idea of that early intervention, that preventative approach of a multi-tiered system of support. We screen, we find out who might need more, we put it in place, and we hopefully prevent things that are harmful to children.
Yeah, and I talk a lot just about just being proactive in districts and just getting ahead of things before they become real challenges on this podcast. So something like an MTSS program of intervention would really greatly kind of further that. that
Mhm.
idea and that thought process. How often are those surveys conducted that you just talked about?
In our district, we do surveys twice a year. For everyone. And then as we have students enter into intervention, say, they might be in a 6 week group setting with a social worker or a counselor developing certain skills, we do what's called progress monitoring. We make sure that the things that they're learning in that group are being applied, and we look at how they're behaving in the time in that group and if they're making progress. And if students make progress, that's fantastic. We keep it going. If they're not making progress, that's where we can adjust and potentially layer on even more support or a more intensive or individualized approach for that child. So we don't wait and see. We're really looking all throughout the time in that intervention to see, is that this child learning and able to apply the skills that we need them to so that they can be most successful in school.
Yeah, yeah. You don't wait and see. That's what jumped out to me there.
Mhm.
As a leader, Assistant Soup, you've been doing what you do successfully for a very long time.
Mhm.
Why do you think it's crucial for schools to take a proactive approach instead of a reactive approach to student mental health?
Well, that's a very big question. Um, why? Because we don't have any time to waste.
Mm,
We have kids that have significant needs in our schools, and we also have an educational system that I believe is very taxed right now. We have teachers that are being asked to do all kinds of things, and we're making up for other systems that are lacking. Schools, in the years that I've been in education, I have only seen the responsibility of schools increase. And I believe it's going to continue to increase and increase and increase. And that means that our teachers have a ton on their plate. So I always look at it as we have a couple options. We can build systems that prevent problems that take up teacher time and distract from learning, or we can wait and see, and we are going to run into issues, and that is also going to take teachers time and distract from learning. And usually when we wait and see, the way that that plays out is much worse than the ways it would play out if we're preventative. So I think of it as like time for time. We're either going to put
mm.
the time in on the front end, identify the needs, put the resources, the instruction, the intervention in place, and prevent problematic behavior, or we're going to wait, we're not going to put those things in place, and the problematic behavior will occur. I mean, we're dealing with children and they're still learning, they're still developing their skill sets. So, there's a lot of unpredictable in the school setting, but there's also a lot of predictable. We know kids will need time to develop their social skills and their abilities to interact appropriately with each other. So if we know that's going to happen, why would we wait and not take a preventative approach that could really keep us from managing things in a negative way down the road?
Yeah, yeah, that's an amazing response. And I think, just in the way of predictability, right? You're dealing with kids of different ages and
Mhm.
uh, they aren't fully developed. They haven't fully come up with ways to express themselves or get out their emotions or share openly. What are you doing specifically in your district to help build a culture where students feel safe reporting concerns about themselves or their peers?
That is one of the things I'm most proud of in our district, that I think our staff have really embraced. We have tried very strategically, really over the last decade, to create a culture where students are open and trusting and will report. And that's what I think we've achieved. And I know that because when we receive alerts, when we receive alerts from our online monitoring of student interactions and what they're writing, what they're searching, those types of things, a lot of times it's actually emails from students to teachers saying, hey, I'm struggling with this, can you help me? Or I don't like how this child's interacting with me, what can I do about it? And so we know that we've established that culture because we see it in the reports that we get from students that allow us to intervene right away before we have a conflict in our schools or before something gets out of hand. What we did to establish that is we took a multi-tiered system of approach. We started with tier one and said, how do we make sure that every classroom community is one where kids feel that they can be themselves, that they are psychologically and emotionally safe in that place? Um, Strategies that we used were opening and closing circles. So we start the day with a circle and let every student share. Make sure there's equity of voice, make sure students are able to say what they need to say, and really mentally and emotionally transition from their home into the school setting and get ready to learn. And then we end the day with the same thing. That practice in itself is huge in building a classroom community, and one in which students are ready and able to share. Not to mention the benefits that it has linguistically for students to just practice the language, practice sharing out, express themselves appropriately. There's a ton of social skill development that happens just in that one strategy. And that's what we started with about a decade ago. Then we built on classroom climate and management plans. So, how do we set up our classroom for success? What does it look like to share high expectations for every child? What will it look like to have consequences for helpful behavior and harmful behavior? How are we reinforcing the good? And how are we correcting the things that we would like to see less of in the school setting? We talked about the classroom environment, what it looks like, what it feels like, what students are seeing around them, and how we involve families in it. Um, and the last big piece of that plan is social emotional learning. So in our district, we incorporate social and emotional learning for every student on at least a weekly basis, and it is skill focused. So that in itself is just tier one, where we really hone in on what does a safe learning community look like, and what are the practices that promote it, and how are we explicitly and directly instructing students in social skills and emotional skills on a weekly basis. So establishing those pieces, I think, were a huge driver in creating the type of community where students are going to report things that are not going right and seek solutions for them with the adults in the school, with the trusted adult.
This episode is brought to you by Gaggle. Gaggle is the industry leader in protecting students' physical safety and mental well-being through best-in-class technology and people solutions. With over 25 years of experience, Gaggle analyzes billions of pieces of student online content and provides thousands of teletherapy sessions to students and staff each school year. Ready to level up student safety? Connect with Ray Bledsoe at rbledsoe@gaggle.net.
That's awesome because I heard you say you incorporate things that allow students to have their own voices and students can speak up and actually play an active part in this multi-tiered plan that you've come up with the district. That is huge because in order for this to be successful, and you know this probably better than I do, the students have to have buy-in and they have to be willing to be able to communicate and share, but also participate in their own growth and learning as well.
Mhm.
On the leadership side, I'm curious to know what are the key responsibilities of district leadership in ensuring student safety and well-being?
Mm. Yeah, we have a pretty high commitment from our district leaders, from our Board of Education, through superintendent, assistant superintendents. We have a pretty large district, so we have multiple positions. We have a director of safety and security that works within our student services and support department. We have a director of social emotional learning that works in our department, and so we also have an MTSS person. So that group being in the same department allows us to really collaborate with each other and say, how are we taking a comprehensive look at student safety and support, from that tier one instructional piece to our facilities planning and how are we setting up our safety procedures, our drills, to mental health and how we are responding and connecting students with our community agencies and mental health practitioners for things that may happen outside of the school day as well. Because while we are responsible for the educational impact of students and the educational outcomes, we also know that there are things that kids are dealing with that may not result in an educational change, but they still need support with. And that's where I think that mental health and therapy component comes in, and where we have to really work through what is an educational response and then what is an additional like community agency type response for our students.
Yeah. Katie, I'd like to expand on that. How do you envision a therapy option complementing existing intervention programs like your MTSS program? And are there any unique benefits that you believe it could provide to the students in need?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of benefits to having a program that you work with. And districts do this in many different ways. And I would say for every district, at minimum, you should have connections with your community agencies, know who is in your area, who your providers are, be connecting with them regularly, seeing what it looks like for them to provide to your families and to your students. Because sometimes just a very simple connection, hey, Miss So and so, did you know that this agency does this and there's no charge for that? And that's something that you could access. Sometimes that's all it takes. And a family's like, I had no idea. And that would be fantastic for us. And thank you for connecting us. So it can be very simple. It can also be a much more strategic or systematic approach. And that's what we've done. So over the last years, we've worked very closely with community agencies, but we still find that there are barriers to accessing mental health for some of our families. Sometimes we find that language is a barrier. We need to have Spanish speaking practitioners, and they may not be available. We have wait lists in our area as well. So we may be able to get someone counseling services, but they can't start for 6 months, and that's not going to meet the need right now. So, we took a more systematic approach of partnering with a company that can help us provide that, as well as utilizing our community agencies. So we do both things. Telehealth has been great because for some families that transportation is an issue, right? Or timing is an issue, and telehealth opens up a lot more possibilities. For others, depending on the need, they really need to have an in-person visit. So we now have our social workers, counselors, and administrators on the same page of deciding, for this child, is this a school-based need? If it is, we are going to provide intervention. If it's not a school-based need, we have an option of community agencies and in-person support for mental health, and we have an option of telehealth support for mental health. And we really just look at the context of the situation and what we think will serve the family best. But expanding our options has been great because when we hit a roadblock here, we can go a different direction, and we're not tied to any one support.
And that's key, right? It's always good to have a multi-tiered approach, no pun intended,
Mhm.
to mental health and to student safety as well, just to make sure you cover all the bases. Is there any specific data or feedback that you could share from students, parents, or staff that kind of highlights the demand for therapy services in the district and the potential impact on your students?
One of the pieces of input we receive are alerts and reports. So we have a lot of reporting systems. We have monitoring systems for online activity. We have hotlines set up and tip lines at our school that students will, we have forms, QR codes, so a student can scan a QR code and fill out a form. I have this safety concern, or I saw this happen, or I'm worried about something happening. So all of those pieces are in place. And like I said, some of the input we get from that is that students are reporting appropriately, which is what we want to see. We want to see a ton of reporting because it tells us that we've established that trust and that openness with each student. In terms of feedback, that's a little bit harder to collect. When we have services in place, we're always connecting back to say, how is that going? And it's more anecdotal in nature. So from a district perspective, we've not yet found the right way to collect that quantitatively, but we have the anecdotal qualitative information of whether it's working or not working, and if we should continue or adjust based on what we put in place for the individual child or family.
Yeah, yeah, and I get with just different restrictions and laws that some of that can't be released, but at least it sounds like you're seeing some progress in some forms throughout the district,
Yeah.
just with the ways that you're tracking and keeping up. So I'm going to address the elephant in the room here. Some district leaders are watching this podcast and they're saying, "Hey, that sounds great. That's amazing that Dr. Ossel is able to get all this stuff done. How in the world is she paying for this?" Let's talk funding. There are a lot of challenges, especially in recent days, with districts getting funding and resources for the amenities and the services that they need to provide their students and staff. What are some ways that you've gone about funding these initiatives in your district?
Yeah. One of the strategies that I have routinely used that I found very successful is starting with grant funding. So when we have a new initiative or we're trying something out, we're piloting or we're taking a new step forward, I often will utilize grant funding for that. Particularly, Title IV funding has been helpful with mental health, safety and security, and social emotional learning initiatives. And then once we see success with it and we demonstrate that success, I'm regularly reporting out to our superintendent and to our Board of Education. Here's what we've put in place. This is what we're seeing as a result. And we believe this should be adopted and incorporated into our budget. And that's where budgeting conversations hold a little more weight. So I think with district leaders, with building leaders, it's something to think about. How can you establish a new funding source for a new initiative? Then how can you make sure that you are really gathering that data on the success of it and then demonstrating that back out to your contributors in your community? And when you're demonstrating that success, then there's the willingness to say, okay, let's look at the budget and see how we can make this a permanent budget item. So that has been a progression that I've used over and over in my years in district leadership, to ensure that we are seeking solutions, we're demonstrating success, and then we're finding ways to incorporate that in the budget once it is proven successful.
That's great. What other thoughts do you have just around the importance of mental health, not just for students, because I want this to be an encompassing conversation, but what about your staff? How are you taking care of your staff in the way of mental health?
Yeah, I think you can't have the student conversation without having the staff conversation, because the reality is that when you have great educators like we do, they are concerned about and thinking about kids all the time. I mean, really around the clock. And if we don't set up systems that allow our educators to take a break, have a respite from their work, that's not healthy for them either. So years ago, I remember we had social workers that were feeling like all summer long they had to be checking email. They're not on contract. They should be enjoying their summer. They should be taking that reprieve. And instead, they were regularly checking email, like what if a student needs me, or if someone reaches out, or they're, having concerns, particularly during COVID-19. This was a huge conversation. And we really wanted to establish that you also need to take care of yourself and your own well-being. And that means you have to allow yourself breaks from your workday. So we can't get caught up in a 24/7 kind of mentality. We need to have systems and supports that are in place that allow us to step away and reset and come back whole for the children in front of us. So some of these online monitoring systems are exactly what can do that for us. They can monitor and they can look at the level of risk or the level of concern of what students are saying. And when that's in place, then you can gauge, do I need to respond to this right now? Can I respond in the morning? Or know that, for me as a district leader, if it's extreme, I'm going to get a phone call. And I know that. So it
Hmm.
allows me to step away from my computer and take the time that I need and be with my family. It allows our teachers to do the same and take the time that they need. They have lives outside of work too, and they need to reset to be well. So, telehealth is one of the options that helps with that as well, because we know we have mental health supports in place for certain students that may need that, and they have someone outside of the school system that they can reach out to. So, these are just a couple examples of how we set up and use our technology, and use our resources to put things in place that allow for teachers to be on during the school day and take time off and have a life outside of school as well, so that they can be their best for students each morning when they get there.
Absolutely. And you alluded to this some, but the next question I was going to ask you is that as a district leader, how do you personally step away and reset and make sure that your mental health is taken care of as well?
Mhm. Yeah, it's easy to take home all the things that you hear and experience and the tough situations that are in front of us each day. I will say for me personally, I try to make sure that when I'm going in that direction of thinking about the negatives, that I push myself in the other direction as well. Because when you're disciplined enough to think of what's going well, there are always lots of examples. So for me, there's a personal piece of it of just balancing what I am allowing myself to really spend time thinking about. I am absolutely going to think about that student who has significant needs and whatever going on in their life that's causing us to provide more intervention and more support and get them the services they need. But I am also going to think about the progress that child's making and the fact that this allowed us to put services in place. We got the information we needed to have that provided to him or her on a regular basis. And that is a huge celebration in itself. And now we're moving in the right direction. So, Dr. Holly is a great resource. And I remember him saying, first thought, last thought, right? So I try to have this mentality of don't let your first thought be your last thought. And that's what he said repeatedly to our staff in professional development. If we allow our first thought to be our last thought, we often get stuck. And that's where we can introduce bias, negative thinking, patterns that are not healthy for us. So I always just finish that first thought with a last thought of, and where are we going? And what have we done as a result? And where could that lead us in the future?
Yeah, you're looking at the journey in its entirety, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's actually a good segue. So along the lines of last thoughts, uh, as a final thought here, what message would you like to leave our listeners with regarding the importance of prioritizing student mental health in our schools, and how can they support these efforts in their own communities?
Yeah. I think, most importantly for us, it's having layers of support that meet needs of different groups of kids. So, how have you set up your universal approach that's going to meet the needs of most? And is that skill focused, right? Not just talking about feelings, but what are the skills associated with the social and emotional aspects of school and of life? And are we giving students the skills that they need to navigate the tough things that will happen? Because that's, again, we know that there's going to be tough things that happen for all of us, for our students, for the adults. And if we have the skills to navigate it, we are all in a safer and more secure position to do so. So universally, think about what you can put in place for all. Then really look at what is that next layer of intervention that a school can provide when there's an educational outcome that needs to be met. Do we have the right people to do that? Can we train people to do that? What are the resources we're going to use? Then what is another layer we can provide? And then in addition to our educational services, what can we set people up with outside of school that can support evenings, weekends, summers, and make sure that students have someone to report to both in the school setting and outside of the school setting. And really take one step at a time. If all of that sounds foreign to you, start with tier one. What do we want to teach students that we think could prevent conflict or issues in the future that could be unsafe in our school environment?
That was amazing. And kudos to you and hats off to you and the entire district for the work that you're doing there. You guys are doing some amazing things, and hopefully the listeners and everybody else that's tuned in will get some good pointers and some helpful tips from you. So thank you. Thank you also for joining, and we appreciate the time. And thank you everybody else for joining us on the Leaders Saving Lives podcast. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.
Thank you for listening. If you found this conversation valuable, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps others discover the show and supports our mission. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'll see you next time on Leaders Saving Lives.